I call Chris Hipkins, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, normally I would say that I welcome the opportunity to participate in a debate. I have to say today I don't particularly welcome the opportunity to participate in this debate because I think every one of the children that we are talking about, every one of the cases that we are talking about is a personal and individual tragedy. And I think I want to begin with a quote from the Minister herself, who said, "If the state takes them into their care and then they have a responsibility to make sure those kids' lives, those kids live better lives, and I don't see the evidence, and the Children's Commissioner report doesn't see the evidence that this is happening." That is a damning indictment on the system, and I do want to compliment the Minister on her candour and on being so abrupt and honest about the situation, because as I said, this is an absolute tragedy for all of those children, and we all have a responsibility to do something about that. I want to also acknowledge the enormous weight of burden that we place on the people who work at Child, Youth and Family. I have come into contact with them on multiple occasions, as just about every member of Parliament will have, and I can say that they deal with the most difficult, complex, heart-wrenching situations that you could possibly imagine. And they often find themselves in situations where no matter which way they turn, they are confronted with problems. And I want to really acknowledge that and say that I think that by and large they work so hard and they try to do such a good job, and it is very, very complex and very, very difficult. I want to also acknowledge, though, that we need to look at alternatives in some cases. I think particularly of the debate that we had several years ago around special residential schools. Many of the kids who attended those schools had been in SIFS care or went into SIFS care at the end of it. And I tell you what, I went into that with a view that those schools wouldn't serve a place in the future of the education system. I visited them and I came out with a completely the opposite view, because I spoke to many of those kids, and the thing that struck me about it was that they got in there and they were allowed to be kids. They were allowed to play, they were allowed to learn, they had the freedom to actually grow up and to be kids and to be loved, and it was the most supportive and nurturing environment that I could imagine for them. Many of them had never had that outside of that special residential school environment, and we're now down, only 2 of those schools are left. And I think that there is a place for that kind of intervention in the system, and we need to rethink whether the closure of those types of facilities was the right thing to do, because I actually think they do provide an alternative to foster care for some of those very vulnerable children, and they did have, by and large, a good track record in recent history. And I know that there were historical issues, but in recent history they had a very good track record, and I think we need to re-examine whether in fact there's a greater role for those sorts of organisations and those sorts of facilities. The other point that I want to make is that Child, Youth and Family deal in a space that is still incredibly disjointed, and many of those kids and families find themselves coming under the jurisdiction and being subject to probing by multiple government agencies, whether it's Child, Youth and Family, whether it's the police, various health services including mental health, and it is simply those families get lost. And often in cases of child abuse, yes, there'll be a perpetrator, but there will often be other victims, including the children, and it is such a horrific experience often for families to navigate their way through that system, and we must do a better job of supporting those vulnerable children and families through the system so that we can get better outcomes. It's not just Child, Youth and Family, it's about actually getting all of the agencies involved in dealing with these vulnerable children, working more collaboratively together to get better outcomes. The number of times when I talk to a parent of a child who is involved with Child, Youth and Family, and often they won't be the parent that has caused the child to be involved in Child, Youth and Family, and they will talk about speaking to Child, Youth and Family and being said, well, you have to talk to the police about that. Speaking to the police who say, well, you've got to talk to Child, Youth and Family about that. Speaking to mental health who'll say, well, you've got to talk to someone else. And they just get lost in the system. And that is how kids fall through the cracks. We have to do a lot more about that. And Mr. Speaker, finally, I want to say sometimes we think this is other people. These are other people's children. And I can say No one is immune from this. No one knows when they're going to come into contact with someone who ends up involved in these kind of situations. We should all care about this. These are all going to be kids who are going to enter into our community. We should care about this. We have to get it right.